Here's another question from one Lowell. As you know, nonprofits are under extreme pressure not only financially, but in terms of increased reporting and performance metrics. These trends are putting a great deal of stress on already struggling and under-resourced entities. I would like to know where you see these funding and metric trends going. Also, recent research has shown that young nonprofit professionals are concerned about the stress, hours, and compensation within the sector. With ever-increasing numbers of boomers retiring, what and where are the next leaders coming from?
Okay, those are two big questions. The first one, the trend in metrics. I think there was a bit of maybe of an overdose of metrics for a while there, where it seemed that everybody wanted metrics, and the more metrics, the better. And foundations and donors were asking for all sorts of measurement from nonprofits, and nonprofits were sort of scrambling to come up with those. I think the first wave of that is past, and the field, meaning the entire field of social change, I think has begun to learn more about what metrics matter and which ones matter less, what to count and what not to count. And I think we're beginning to see the demands being put on nonprofits be a little more rational and less burdensome. I think another really healthy trend I've seen, there's some very good work that's been done by the Foundation Strategy Group, led by Mark Kramer, on shared metrics. And there's a number of really interesting examples around the country where nonprofits working jointly on an issue like school reform or inner city revival, very large numbers of nonprofits have got together, in some cases with donors, and really come up with shared metrics that they're going to agree on in terms of these are the metrics that matter for us to assess change, and we're all going to accept the same metrics and measure ourselves by them. So that takes the burden off every individual organization, and I think also fosters collaboration. So I hope we'll see more of that in the future. The second question about sort of generational shift in the nonprofit sector, there was actually some work done. There was a good study done by the Meyer Foundation in Washington, D.C. about where the next generation of nonprofit leaders is going to come from. And there was this prediction that the baby boomers are going to retire, and they did some survey research and found that younger people in nonprofits often found that they were stuck. And then they also looked at the jobs that their bosses had and saw that they spent all their time fundraising, they worked long hours, they didn't have much time for hobbies or for their family, and they were young professionals were questioning whether or not these are jobs they wanted. I think the recession has changed quite a bit. We may have another problem. A lot of people who were close to retirement, which would be a lot of nonprofit executives, saw their retirement income, their retirement resources, really hit hard by the economic downturn. And I don't have research on this, but just anecdotally talking to people that lead organizations, a lot of them are really reevaluating whether or not they can afford to retire. So we may actually be in a situation where we see a generation of leaders, baby boomers, who are going to postpone their retirement for a while. And that may actually exacerbate the problem. I think the countervailing trend in this is that digital technology is changing everything. It's changing the structure of organizations, the way they manage knowledge, and the way they communicate. And the people that best understand the technology and how to use it and its potential are people that grew up with it. And that favors young leaders. And my guess is that most organizations will be finding ways to use more and more of the talent of people that understand digital technology and social media.
That's interesting. That it really is going to be coming from those who grew up with it. It's obviously it's an easier path to track when you've been brought up with the evolution of technology as you yourself have evolved.
Yeah.
But it's going to be an interesting crossroads, I think, for the two generations to coexist for a while.
Exactly. Yeah. We had just our own organization when we had one of our youngest employees, actually someone who's just out of college and it's her first job, give a presentation to our board, and the title of her presentation was Growing Up Digitally, in which she basically explained how her life had been a life based on using social media, both for advocacy, for getting information, and also for leisure. And it was a really interesting conversation with the board about this.
Here's another question from Revelation Action finalist called Red Tomato. It's oh so tempting and also just plain easier and lower risk for philanthropists to fund changemakers who already have a proven track record. Maybe after a decade at it or after a breakthrough or two, they attempt to scale up their success. But perhaps the most compelling change a changemaker could fund would be to pay for the development of an undeveloped breakthrough idea at the early raw stages when the social entrepreneur really needs the funding the most. How might a philanthropist recognize such an opportunity?
Yeah, well, that's a question with a lot of assumptions incorporated in it. I do agree with the basic assumption. In general, philanthropists are more comfortable funding people who have at least some track record. And when you stop to think about it, it makes sense. Obviously, there are lots of people out there that have ideas, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they know how to implement them and grow an organization around them. So I think some of those funders fund the kind of startup work through organizations like Ashoka, basically. They fund organizations that find change makers, that find social entrepreneurs, and germinate the ideas. Now that's indirect funding as opposed to direct funding. Jeff Skoll does that quite a bit with the Skoll Foundation and their program. But I also do think there is a new breed of donor. I think some of the donors whose fortunes came out of Silicon Valley, if you look at the Omidyar Foundation, they're willing to often take a risk on somebody who's got a really good idea and really wants to start something fresh and really look at this more almost like a venture capitalist would. I think in general, though, it's safe to say that philanthropy is much more risk adverse than venture capital. Anyone who's, they'll say that if you work in Silicon Valley, in a way that you're nobody unless you've got a few failures under your belt. And I think philanthropists really don't tolerate failure near as much, or don't expect to fail near as much as venture capitalists do. So my advice would be to look for donors that really clearly have a social entrepreneur and a kind of venture approach to philanthropy if you're really at the early raw stages like the question asked.